Hi everybody, my name is Jen Stephen, and today we're going to talk a little bit about grieving the loss of a person through death. I'm a registered counsellor and I also work full-time at JoshGen Church, and I'm part of the Sunningdale AM congregation there. But today, what I want to share mostly comes out of my own personal journey. So when I was at university, my mom passed away suddenly in a car accident, and it's probably been one of the most defining moments of my life. I can look back almost 17 or just over 17 years later and know that I can honestly sit here and say it's been one of those things that God has worked for the good. But I want to try and just share for those of you that are maybe fairly near the beginning of this journey or where the grief is really raw. I just want to try and share some tips and handles as to how to best navigate this really difficult time. If you haven't yet watched the other video on grieving loss during COVID-19, I'd really encourage you to watch that at this point, because I've just shared a few tips there in terms of grieving in general and some of the stages of grief. I'm not going to really revisit those today, so that would be a useful resource to watch before you watch this one. So when we have a trauma, it's a sudden or unexpected event where there's loss involved, and trauma takes us by surprise. And I've often heard people speak where there's been an prolonged illness or where someone's death has almost been anticipated in some way, and yet the sense of trauma still seems to be the same. I want to just encourage you that no matter whether you feel mentally prepared or not prepared, the journey is maybe slightly different in some ways, but there are certain hallmarks that are the same. And so this trauma creates a vulnerability in us. And one of the things I've come to realize walking with others and also just my own journey is that in those moments of vulnerability, the enemy is like a prowling lion, and he does try to seek to wound and hurt us even more than the actual grief that we're experiencing in that moment. So something to be aware of is that he is out to kill, steal, and destroy. But as Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis 50, verse 20, that what they had planned for evil, God can use for good, for the saving of many lives. And I want to encourage you, if you're in that raw stage, is to remember that God can work this together for your good. Grief is a journey of many layers, and often it feels like we're revisiting the same thing time and time again. Even almost 17 years later, there's things that God still touches on. But I want to encourage you that each time it's from a different vantage point. It's almost like a spiral staircase. And as you climb up the stairs, you may come to a window in a tower and think, I've seen this view before. And then God deals with something and you carry on and you come to the next. But each time you one layer up. And so I want to encourage you that even though God might revisit certain things, or you might feel like you've almost gone back to the beginning, be encouraged that God's just dealing on a deeper layer with some of the things that we need to process. Time doesn't heal, but God does. And this is an important thing to remember, is that over time, if you allow God to, he will come and touch those places that are paining and hurting, and he can bring life into those places. Remember, these stages that we talked about in the previous video often go backwards and forwards. So you may feel like you've conquered a certain thing, and next thing find yourself back in the throes of that stage of anger or frustration or questioning. That's okay. Bring that before the Lord and allow him to touch those places and be with you in those places. Grief also often triggers other wounds, and this has been part of my journey. I realized during this time in the first couple of years is that identity was a massive issue. And it's something that I'd been able to cover over and carry on with. And as grief ripped off the layers and meant that I didn't have that many emotional reserves left, the Lord said, okay, now's the time to deal with these things. So realize that even in the middle of the grief, God might be wanting to touch on deeper wounds and other things. And it's super important in this time to be accountable and walk closely with leaders. Pull your leaders close. Let them know what you're feeling, what you're struggling with, so that they can speak truth into those areas. just practically, let's have a look at a couple of areas that are helpful to work with and think through. I often think of ourselves as we are not just physical beings or emotional beings. We're made up of a number of different aspects. So on a physical level, grief is exhausting. I hadn't realized how exhausting grief was, but it really is. It takes it out of you physically. So put the basics in place, things that we know we should generally do anyway. Get enough sleep. Try and do some form of exercise, even though it feels like the last thing that you want to do. Get your diet right. Eat healthily. Sometimes a vitamin B jab or taking some extra vitamins at this time is really important. Our bodies physically take strain when we're going through this. Also, when trauma happens, there's a flood of chemicals that come into our brains and into our minds. So on a physical level, our bodies are dealing with a whole lot. So look after yourself physically. Then it's our mind and our thinking patterns. Sometimes, in fact, most times, we have to choose life. We have to choose truth. Often our feelings and our thoughts will tell us something completely different. But it's so important at this time to go back to the Word of God and say, what does God say about this situation? His truth doesn't change. Although our experience of our world and our raw, grieving hearts would sometimes want us to, or lead us to question what He's doing, He is faithful and doesn't change. So sometimes we have to make a conscious choice in this time to choose truth. Also, sometimes we need others to help point out unhealthy thinking patterns. Even in the middle of our grief, we need those to sometimes bring correction and say to us, hold on, you're going down a dangerous path, and point us back towards Jesus. Pull a few people close that you can trust to do that with you. Our emotions. I was or am still quite an emotionally based person, and depending on how I feel or in the moment will often be how I react to things. And over the time of losing my mom, I had to learn to submit my emotions to Christ. He is the one that is going to control. We don't make our decisions and be ruled by our emotions. As much as then that said, we do need to process them. Emotions are real. Jesus felt emotions. And so it's to allow ourselves to process these things, to work through them, but to remember that our emotions cannot rule our decisions. And so one of the things that has been such a comfort to me is to know that God went through, well, Jesus went through the whole expanse of emotion. He knows rejection. He knows loss. He knows pain. He lost his friend Lazarus, even though he knew he was going to raise him from the dead. But I want to say that come before Jesus with your emotions and submit them to him. Allow him to work in those emotions. Process them with someone you trust. Often we tend to isolate or withdraw or think that we need to have it all together in this time. That's not the case. Go alongside those who can encourage you and who can help point you in the right direction. As I've said before, this is one of the most vital things to do in a grieving process. And finally, spiritually, ask God what he wants to do in this time. Ask him to heal you. Ask him to reassure you. He is faithful and good, and we can know that he is always there for us. One of the things that has been one of my biggest comforts is to realize that death has lost its sting and it's lost its bite. And although it's painful now, we can know that God has taken the sting out of death. And so in time, walk with the Holy Spirit, allow him to heal those places in you. And you will laugh again and you will smile again. Sometimes I remember having moments thinking, will I ever just laugh and feel happy again? And I can honestly say that joy does come again. So trust God with your journey, yield it to him. Allow him to be close to you in this time and allow him to walk this journey with you. He understands grief. I think that was one of my biggest comforts, was we don't serve a God who doesn't know what we feel. He is close and he knows what we feel in this time. May Jesus comfort and hold you. If you're in a grief process or walking closely with someone who's in a grieving process, my prayer for you is that you would know his presence and that as you walk this journey, that on the other side, you'd look back and realize that you look more like him and that you are closer to him. Thank you for your time today.